You ever watch someone destroy their own life with a smile on their face? That's exactly what Deborah Pike was doing at 8:12 a.m. under a brutal 92-degree sun, the kind of heat that makes asphalt breathe and plastic smell like it's melting. I heard the sound before I saw her, metal scraping glass, slow and deliberate, like she wanted the whole parking lot to hear it. By the time I stepped off the curb, she already had half the sticker peeled back from my windshield, her manicured nails pinching the edge like she was pulling a weed out of her garden. She didn't even look at me at first, just kept going, jaw tight, eyes focused, like this was some kind of community service. Then she yanked the last strip free, crumpled it in her hand, and finally turned, giving me that thin, satisfied smile. "Problem solved," she said, like she'd just improved my life. The piece of sticker she crushed wasn't just vinyl and adhesive. It was court-ordered. And what she didn't know in that moment, what she couldn't possibly understand yet, was that she hadn't just cleaned up something she thought was ugly. She had just tampered with something a judge required to stay exactly where it was. My name is Ethan Walker, and if you looked at me that morning, you'd probably side with her. Old pickup truck, faded blue paint, a dent on the passenger side that I never bothered fixing, work boots with dust still clinging from the day before. I wasn't the kind of guy HOA presidents liked. I didn't show up to wine nights by the clubhouse, didn't decorate for seasonal themes, didn't pretend the rules were suggestions. I followed them exactly, line by line, because I'd already learned what happens when you don't. Deborah, on the other hand, was exactly what you'd expect. Perfect hair, pressed blouse, clipboard energy without the clipboard. She moved through the neighborhood like everything was hers to correct. And from the day I moved in, she decided those stickers on my truck and mailbox were a problem. She called them eyesores, said they dragged down property value, told people in the community group chat that some residents just didn't respect standards. What she never did, what she never thought she needed to do, was ask why they were there. Because if she had, she would have seen the documentation I submitted to the HOA. The week I moved in, she would have seen the notice, the reference number, the language that made it very clear those markers were not optional. But Deborah didn't read documents. Deborah enforced feelings. And that morning, she felt like my truck needed to be fixed. The heat shimmered off the pavement as I walked closer, and I could see the residue left behind where she'd scraped, thin streaks of adhesive catching the light. A small piece of the sticker had fallen near the tire, still curling at the edges, and the scraper she used glinted in her hand like a badge. "You're welcome," she added, like I owed her something. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just looked at the glass, then at her, then back at the glass again, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her slightly uncomfortable. "Did you keep any of it?" I asked. She frowned, confused for half a second, then shrugged. "Why would I? It was trash." That was the moment I knew this was already over for her. Because she didn't understand what she'd just done. She thought she removed something meaningless. She thought she cleaned up a visual annoyance. But those stickers were never about looks. They were markers, identifiers, part of a standing order tied to a dispute that hadn't fully closed yet. They existed for one reason, to make sure nothing about my property was altered without record. And now, thanks to Deborah, there was a record, not just of the sticker being there, but of it being removed. I reached into my truck, pulled out a slim black folder, the kind most people would ignore, edges slightly worn from being opened too many times. Inside was a copy of the order, stamped, signed, dated. I didn't hand it to her yet. Not yet. Because moments like this, you don't rush them. You let the weight build. You let the other person stand in their confidence just a little longer. Deborah shifted her stance, glancing around as if expecting someone to back her up, maybe a neighbor watching from a balcony, maybe someone who'd agree she did the right thing. But the parking lot was quiet except for the hum of a distant AC unit and the faint click of a security camera mounted above Building C, angled perfectly toward us. She followed my gaze for a split second, then looked back at me. "If you have a problem," she said, tone sharpening, "you can bring it up at the next HOA meeting." I almost smiled, because what she didn't realize, what she still didn't see, was that this was never going to be an HOA issue. This was already bigger than her, bigger than the board, bigger than her little authority. She thought she had just enforced a rule. In reality, she had just stepped directly into a situation where the rules had already been written by someone with far more power than she could imagine. I did not hand her the document right away because moments like that are not about proving you are right. They are about letting the other person walk just far enough in the wrong direction that turning back is no longer an option. Deborah crossed her arms and shifted her weight onto one heel. Already bored, already convinced this conversation was beneath her. The sun was still climbing, pressing heat into the windshield where the sticker had been, and I could see the faint outline it left behind, a ghost shape catching the light at just the right angle. That outline mattered more than she understood. You really should take better care of your property, she added, glancing at the residue like it offended her personally. This is exactly the kind of thing that brings the whole neighborhood down. I nodded once, slow, like I was considering her advice, even though my attention had already moved past her words to everything else happening around us. The camera above Building C made a quiet mechanical adjustment, tracking movement, its lens angled perfectly toward my truck. Mrs. Lang from Unit 204 had her blinds cracked open just enough to watch without being seen, and the security guard who usually did his rounds at this hour had paused near the far gate, pretending to check his phone. Deborah thought this was a private correction. It was not. It was a recorded event. You said you took pictures, right? I asked, keeping my voice even. She lifted her chin slightly. Of course I did. Before and after. Documentation matters. That almost made me smile again. Documentation matters. She had no idea how right she was. Good, I said. That helps. That was the first time her expression shifted, just a fraction, like something in my tone did. Not match what she expected. She narrowed her eyes slightly. Helps what? I finally opened the folder, sliding out the top page just enough for the seal to catch the sunlight. It was not dramatic. I did not shove it in her face. I just let it exist between us, visible enough to be real, distant enough to feel out of reach. Those stickers were placed under a standing court order, I said. They are not decoration. They are required to stay exactly where they were. She stared at the page, then at me, then back at the page again, and I could almost see her mind trying to reframe the situation into something she could still control. That does not make any sense, she said quickly. No judge is going to care about something like that. This is an HOA community. There it was. That certainty. That belief that her authority was the highest one in the room. I did not argue with her. I just flipped the page, letting the language show itself, the case number, the stamped seal, the line that specified preservation of identifiable markers tied to the property. It already made sense to the judge, I said quietly. The heat pressed down harder, and for a moment neither of us spoke. A car door slammed somewhere down the row, the echo sharp in the still air, and Deborah shifted again, this time less confidently. Even if that is real, she said, her voice tightening just a little, you should have informed the board more clearly. We cannot enforce standards if people are doing whatever they want. I let that hang there, because this was the part she did not know about. I did inform the board, I said, in writing, with attachments, before I moved in. Her lips pressed together, and for the first time, she looked unsure, not because she believed me yet, but because the possibility that she had missed something had entered the room. Well, she said after a beat, straightening her posture again, trying to rebuild that confidence. Then this will get sorted at the meeting. We will review everything properly. That was when I closed the folder. Not aggressively. Not with attitude. Just a quiet, final motion. It already is getting sorted, I said. Just not the way you think. She frowned, and I could see the irritation returning, stronger. Now, fueled by the idea that I was talking in circles. But I was not. Every second that passed, every word she said, every image she had already taken, every trace left on that glass, was building something she could not see yet. The outline on my windshield, the missing sticker, the residue she failed to clean, the camera above us, the timestamps on her photos, the message she sent to the community chat the night before calling my property an embarrassment, all of it was aligning into a record that did not care about her opinion. And Deborah Pike, standing there in the heat with a scraper in her hand and confidence still clinging to her voice, had just placed herself right at the center of it. By noon, the heat had turned the parking lot into a mirror of light and pressure, the kind that makes every sound sharper and every mistake louder. Deborah had already walked away like she had finished something important, heels clicking against the pavement, phone in hand, probably drafting another message about community standards and visual harmony. I stayed where I was for a few seconds longer, letting the silence settle back in, Then I crouched down and picked up the small, torn piece of sticker near my tire. It curled slightly in my fingers, the adhesive still tacky, catching a bit of dust from the ground. That tiny piece mattered more than it looked. Everything did. I stood up and glanced at the faint outline left on the glass again, then at the camera above Building C, then at the row of units where curtains had shifted just enough to suggest people were watching. They always watched. They just rarely understood what they were seeing until it was too late. I opened my truck door, reached into the center console, and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone yet, just to take a slow, deliberate set of photos. Close-up of the residue. Wide shot of the windshield. The missing section where the sticker had been. The ground where the fragment had fallen. Each angle clean, steady, time-stamped. Not rushed. Not emotional. Just recorded. Because that is how this works. Not with arguments. Not with volume. With sequence. With proof. With patience. Deborah thought she had documented a cleanup. I was documenting a violation. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. The neighborhood group chat lit up, just like I expected. Deborah had already posted. There it was, a clean before and after set of images, my truck labeled as an example of improvement, her caption polished and confident, talking about maintaining standards and keeping the community beautiful. A few people reacted with thumbs up. One or two added comments about appreciation. Nobody asked why the stickers had been there. Nobody asked if they were supposed to be there. That is the thing about confidence. It fills in the blanks for people who do not want to think too hard. I read through it once, then locked my screen. I did not respond. Not yet. Because responding there would turn it into an argument. And this was not an argument. This was a timeline. I walked back up to my front door, the handle warm from the sun, stepped inside, and felt the cool air settle around me like a reset. The folder was still in my hand. I set it down on the kitchen counter and opened it again, flipping past the first page to the section most people never read carefully. The language was precise, clinical, almost boring if you did not know what it meant. Preservation of identifiable markers. No alteration without authorization. Any interference subject to review. It did not need to sound dramatic. It just needed to exist. And it did. I pulled out my laptop, opened my email, and started assembling everything. Photos I had just taken. Screenshots of Deborah's post. The timestamp from the camera feed request I had submitted weeks ago when I moved in. The acknowledgment email from the HOA office confirming they had received my documentation back then. It was all there, already connected. All I had to do was line it up. My cursor blinked for a moment in the subject line before I typed it out, simple and direct, referencing the case number, the property address, and the phrase that mattered most. Unauthorized alteration of protected markers. No emotion. No accusations. Just facts. I attached the files one by one, watching the progress bar fill, each document sliding into place like part of a structure that had been waiting for this exact moment. Outside, I could hear a car pulling into the lot, tires rolling over the same stretch of pavement where that piece of sticker had fallen. Earlier, the world kept moving. It always does. That is what makes moments like this so easy to miss if you are not paying attention. Deborah thought this morning was about control, about appearance, about enforcing something she believed she owned. But the truth was, this morning had already shifted into something else entirely. Something quieter, something slower, something that does not need an audience to work. I hit send. Then I closed the laptop, rested my hands on the counter, and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. Somewhere across the complex, Deborah was probably still refreshing the group chat, watching for approval, expecting the story to stay exactly the way she wrote it. But stories like that do not hold up for long when they run into records that cannot be rewritten. And the best part was, she still believed she was in control. For now, the reply did not come right away, and that was exactly how I knew it had landed in the right place. Systems like that do not react fast when something is simple, they react slow when something is serious. I spent the early afternoon like any other day, rinsing dust off my hands in the sink, the water running cold over my knuckles, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet space in my kitchen. But under that quiet, there was a shift, subtle but real, like the air right before a storm you can feel but cannot see yet. Around 2:30, my phone buzzed again, not the quick casual vibration of a group message, but the longer, steadier one that comes with an email marked important. I dried my hands, picked it up, and saw the sender before I even opened it. The property management company. Not Deborah. Not the HOA group. Someone higher in the chain. I opened it slowly, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to read every word the way it was written. The message was short, formal, and careful in its tone. They acknowledged receipt of my documentation, referenced the case number correctly, and confirmed they were reviewing the situation immediately due to potential implications tied to the existing court order. That phrase mattered. Potential implications. That is the kind of language people use when they realize something small is not small at all. I stepped back outside. A few minutes later, the heat still heavy but the lights softer now, shadows stretching longer across the pavement. The spot where Deborah had stood that morning looked exactly the same, but it felt different, like something invisible had been drawn over it. The outline on my windshield was still there, faint but clear if you knew where to look, and the adhesive streaks caught the sunlight in thin lines that had not been there yesterday. Those details were no longer just remnants. They were evidence. Across the lot, I saw Deborah again, this time standing near the mailboxes with another board member, her posture slightly tighter, her gestures sharper. She was talking, explaining something, probably telling her version of the story, the one where she fixed a problem and I was overreacting. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. I had already seen how that version was written. What mattered now was how it would hold up against what had been documented. As I walked toward my truck, she noticed me and paused mid-sentence, her eyes locking onto mine for just a second longer than comfortable. There was still confidence there, but it was thinner now, stretched over something else she had not fully named yet. "We will address this at the meeting," she called out, her voice carrying across the space, louder than it needed to be, like she wanted an audience. "Everything will be reviewed properly." I stopped beside my door, resting my hand against the warm metal, and looked back at her without raising my voice. "It already is," I said. That was all. No explanation. No argument. Just the truth, placed calmly between us. The other board member glanced at Deborah, then back at me, uncertainty flickering across his face like a signal he did not understand yet. Deborah did not respond right away. For a brief moment, the rhythm she had been controlling slipped, and in that gap, something shifted again. Not visible to everyone, but visible to me, because I had seen it before. It is the moment when someone realizes, even if they do not admit it yet, that the situation has moved beyond their reach, that their authority might not be the final one in the room. I opened my truck door, sat down, and let the seat absorb the heat that had built up. All afternoon, the faint smell of adhesive still lingered near the glass, sharp and chemical, mixing with the dry scent of dust and sun-baked plastic. I did not start the engine right away. I just sat there for a second, looking at the empty space where the sticker had been, and then at the small fragment I had placed carefully on the dashboard earlier. That fragment, that residue, that camera angle, that email, they were all connected now, whether Deborah understood it or not. And the system that had received that connection was already moving, slowly, methodically, without needing her permission. Somewhere behind the scenes, people were opening files, matching timestamps, reading language she had ignored, and placing her actions into a context she could not control. Deborah thought this would end in a meeting room, with raised voices and quick votes and community opinions. But what she did that morning did not belong to that world anymore. It had crossed into something quieter, something colder, something that does not rely on who speaks the loudest. And as I finally turned the key and the engine came to life, I realized she was still standing in the same place she had been hours ago, holding on to a version of the story that was already starting to fall apart. By late afternoon, the light had softened into that golden edge that makes everything look calmer than it really is, but nothing about the situation had calmed down. If anything, it had tightened, like a wire being pulled just a little more with every passing hour. I parked back in the same spot, engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out into air that still carried the day's heat. The outline on my windshield had not changed, but now it felt heavier, like it was no longer just a mark but a statement. I ran my fingers lightly across the glass, not touching the residue itself, just tracing the space where the sticker had been, and then I looked toward the camera above Building C again. That angle mattered. It always had. Inside my pocket, my phone buzzed once, then again, two separate notifications close together. I pulled it out and saw a new email thread, this time with more names included. Legal department. Property management. A second address tied to compliance review. That was faster than I expected. I opened it and read carefully. They were requesting confirmation of timeline, asking for any additional supporting material, and noting that they had already begun reviewing recorded footage from the camera covering the parking area. That line alone told me everything I needed to know. The system was not just acknowledging. It was moving. I typed back with precision, attaching the same files again along with a short summary, clear and structured, no emotion, just sequence. Time of incident, location, nature of alteration, reference to the existing order. I did not need to push. I just needed to keep it clean. Across the lot, Deborah's car was still there, but she was not outside anymore. The clubhouse doors were closed, blinds drawn halfway, and there was a faint movement behind the glass, silhouettes shifting in a space that usually stayed open and bright. That told me more than any message could. Something was already being discussed. Something she did not expect to escalate this far. I leaned against my truck for a moment, listening to the low hum of distant traffic beyond the complex, the soft click of cooling metal, and the occasional chirp of a bird cutting through the quiet. Everything felt still on the surface, but underneath, it was all in motion. Then my phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the community group chat. Deborah had posted again. The tone was different now, less confident, more controlled. She mentioned that the situation with my vehicle markings was under review and that residents should refrain from speculation until the board had more information. It was subtle, but the shift was clear. The certainty from earlier had been replaced with caution. She was already adjusting her position. I read it once, then scrolled through the replies. Some confusion. A few questions. One person asking why it was suddenly under review if it had been a violation before. No clear answers. Just noise. I locked my phone and looked back at the windshield. The missing sticker had become the center of something much larger than itself, exactly the way it was designed to if anyone interfered with it. That was the part Deborah never understood. It was not there to look good. It was there to respond. Every detail she touched had a purpose she did not see. The scraper she used had left micro scratches that caught the light differently. Now, the adhesive streaks marked the exact boundary of where the sticker had been. The fragment I picked up sat safely inside my truck, preserved. The camera had captured the motion. Her own photos had captured the before and after, and her post had established intent. It was all aligned now, each piece reinforcing the other, forming something that did not need interpretation. Just review. A door opened behind me, and I turned slightly to see the property manager stepping out of the clubhouse, phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight, focused in a way that was not casual. He paced a few steps, nodding as he listened, glancing once toward my truck, then quickly away. That was the first time I saw it from the outside. Not just as something I was part of, but as something others were now trying to manage. And managing something like this is never simple when it starts with someone acting without checking the boundaries first. Deborah had treated the situation like it was contained, like it belonged to her authority. But now it had expanded beyond that, into channels that do not respond to personality or volume, only to facts. I pushed off the side of my truck and stood there for a second longer, letting the moment settle. The heat was fading, the shadows stretching longer, and the entire scene looked almost peaceful if you ignored what was happening underneath it. Somewhere inside that clubhouse, Deborah was probably explaining herself, trying to reframe what happened into something smaller, something manageable. But the record did not shrink to fit explanations. It stayed exactly as it was. And as I looked at that empty space on my windshield one more time, I knew this was the point where things stopped being about what she thought she could fix and started being about what she could no longer undo. The evening air carried a different kind of weight, cooler on the surface but sharper underneath, like everything had finally settled into place and was waiting for the next move. The clubhouse lights flickered on one by one, casting long reflections across the parking lot, and the blinds that had been half drawn earlier were now fully open. That alone told me something had changed. Conversations that start behind closed doors do not stay there when they begin to matter. I was leaning lightly against my truck when my phone rang. Not a message this time, not an email, but an actual call. Unknown number, local area code. I answered without hesitation. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, measured in a way that did not leave room for interpretation. They introduced themselves as part of the compliance review team tied to the property management group. Not Deborah. Not anyone from the HOA board. Someone outside that circle entirely. They asked me to confirm a few details, the time of the incident, whether the markers had been intact prior to that morning, whether I had any additional documentation beyond what I had already submitted. I answered everything clearly, one point at a time, no extra words, no emotion, just facts placed in order. There was a pause on the line after my last answer, the kind that happens when someone is reviewing something in real time. Then they spoke again, slower this time. They confirmed that the camera footage had already been accessed and that it aligned with my description. They also mentioned that the email I referenced, the one I sent before moving in, had been located in the HOA records and acknowledged by the board at the time. That detail mattered more than anything else. It meant this was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about something that had been known and ignored. I could hear faint background noise on their end, papers shifting, a door closing somewhere, voices low and distant, like I was listening in on a system already in motion. "We will be escalating this for further review," they said. "You will receive formal follow-up shortly. No apology, no opinion, just process." That is how real authority sounds. It does not need to raise its voice. When the call ended, the silence that followed felt different from the silence earlier in the day. It was no longer waiting. It was settled. Across the lot, the clubhouse door opened, and Deborah stepped out with two other board members. Her posture had changed. Not dramatically, not enough for someone who did not know her to notice, but enough for me to see it immediately. The sharp confidence from the morning was gone, replaced by something tighter, more controlled, like she was choosing her movements carefully now. She spotted me again, of course she did, and for a brief second, our eyes met under the glow of the overhead lights. This time, she did not speak first. One of the board members said something to her, low, and she nodded quickly, almost too quickly, before stepping forward a few paces in my direction. "We are reviewing everything," she said, her voice still steady but missing that edge from earlier. There may have been incomplete information. Incomplete information. That was how she chose to describe it. Not a mistake. Not an overstep. Just something not fully understood. I did not move. I did not need to. "You had the information," I said quietly. "You just did not read it." The words were not loud, but they landed exactly where they needed to. The other board members exchanged a glance, subtle but clear, and Deborah's jaw tightened for just a second before she recovered. "We will handle it appropriately," she replied, turning slightly as if to signal the conversation was over. But it was not over. Not for her. Because handling it appropriately now did not mean controlling the outcome. It meant responding to something that had already been set in motion beyond her reach. She turned and walked back toward the clubhouse, the others following close behind, their voices low, urgent in a way that suggested this was no longer a routine issue. I watched them go, then looked back at my windshield one more time. The empty space where the sticker had been felt different now, not like something missing, but like something that had done its job the moment it was removed. That was the part Deborah never saw. The marker was not there to stay untouched forever. It was there to trigger exactly this if someone decided to ignore what it meant. And now it had. The light above the camera flickered once, a small reflection catching in the lens as it adjusted again, still watching, still recording. Everything that needed to be captured had already been captured. Everything that needed to be sent had already been sent. And somewhere behind all of it, people who had never set foot in this parking lot were now looking at the same moment Deborah thought she controlled, seeing it for what it actually was. Not a cleanup, not an improvement, but a line crossed in full view, with no way to step back over it. I reached into my truck, picked up the small fragment of sticker from the dashboard, and turned it between my fingers once before setting it back down. It was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. This one had direction. This one was moving forward, with or without her. The meeting notice went out just before sunset, and it did not read like the usual reminders about landscaping or parking etiquette. It was short, formal, and scheduled for that same evening, which told me everything I needed to know before I even stepped inside the clubhouse. Urgency changes the tone of a place. When I walked in, the air felt tighter, the low hum of conversation cut short the second the door closed behind me. The overhead lights were brighter than usual, reflecting off the polished table in the center of the room where the board had already gathered. Deborah sat at the far end, hands folded, posture straight, but the way her fingers pressed into each other gave her away. That quiet pressure, that tension, it was new. I took a seat without saying anything, setting my folder down in front of me, the same one I had been carrying all day, edges worn, papers inside aligned with a precision that came from repetition. No one asked me to open it. They already knew what was in it. The property manager stood near the head of the table, not sitting, just holding a printed set of documents, flipping through them slowly, as if choosing where to begin. "We are here to address an incident that occurred this morning involving unauthorized alteration of marked property tied to an active legal directive," he said, his voice even, controlled, not aimed at anyone specifically, but landing on Deborah all the same. The room stayed quiet. No side comments. No interruptions. That alone was different from any meeting I had seen in this place before. Deborah cleared her throat slightly, then spoke, her tone measured but thinner than before. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding regarding the purpose of certain visual elements on Mr. Walker's vehicle." Misunderstanding. She was still trying to frame it that way. The property manager did not respond immediately. Instead, he placed one of the printed pages flat on the table and slid it forward just enough for everyone to see. It was a still image from the camera. Feed, time-stamped, clear, showing Deborah at my windshield with the scraper in her hand. The angle was exact, the motion unmistakable. No one said anything for a second longer than comfortable. Then he placed another page beside it. Deborah's own photo. Before and after. The same moment, from a different perspective, confirming the sequence without any gap. "This is not a misunderstanding," he said calmly. "This is a documented alteration of a protected marker." The word protected landed differently in that room. He flipped to the next page, the one with the court language, the seal visible even from where I sat, and read a single line aloud about preservation and non-interference. He did not need to read more. The rest of it was already understood. Deborah shifted in her chair, the confidence she had been holding on to finally slipping in a way that could not be hidden anymore. "I was acting in the interest of the community," she said, her voice a little tighter now, searching for ground that was no longer there. "Those markers were creating a negative impression, and I believed, belief is not the standard here." The property manager interrupted gently, but firmly. "Compliance is." That was the moment the room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a shift in weight, like everyone present felt the balance move from one side to the other. One of the other board members leaned forward, looking more closely at the documents, then at Deborah, then back at the documents again, as if seeing something he had missed earlier. Another member exhaled slowly, shaking his head once under his breath. The conversation Deborah expected, the one where she would guide the outcome, was no longer hers to control. I had not said a word yet. I did not need to. Everything that mattered was already on that table, aligned, verified, reinforced from multiple angles. The fragment of sticker, the residue, the camera, the emails, her own documentation, all of it had converged into a single point that did not require interpretation. The property manager straightened the stack of papers and looked around the room. "We have already initiated a compliance review with external oversight," he said. "Until that process is complete, all enforcement actions related to this matter are suspended, and no further alterations are to be made to the property in question." External oversight. That phrase settled into the room like a final line drawn across everything that had come before. Deborah opened her mouth slightly as if to respond, then stopped, the words not forming the way they used to. For the first time since that morning, she had nothing to say that could change what was already in motion. I finally reached forward and adjusted my folder slightly, not opening it, just placing my hand on top of it for a second, feeling the weight of it under my palm. The same folder she ignored. The same information she chose not to read. The same details that were now defining the outcome of this entire room. And as the meeting continued, voices lower, more careful, more deliberate, it became clear to everyone present that what started as something she thought she could fix with a scraper had turned into something she could not fix at all. The room did not get louder after that. It got quieter, and that kind of quiet carries more weight than any argument ever could. Papers shifted across the table in small, controlled movements, the sound of each page turning sharp against the silence, like every detail being placed under a brighter light. The property manager did not rush, did not raise his voice, did not need to. He simply continued, moving from one document to the next, building something that felt less like a discussion and more like a structure no one in that room could step around. "There is an additional point that needs to be addressed," he said, sliding another sheet forward. "Prior correspondence." My eyes moved to the page before anyone else reacted, and I recognized it immediately. The acknowledgment email. The one sent weeks ago, the one Deborah had claimed was unclear. It was printed in full, time-stamped, and highlighted in 2 places. The subject line referencing the markers, and the response from the board confirming receipt. Not vague, not partial, confirmed. I did not look at Deborah right away. I did not need to. I could feel the shift before I saw it. The kind of shift that happens when a version of reality someone has been holding onto no longer fits the facts in front of them. This was received and acknowledged prior to the incident. The property manager continued, his tone unchanged. Which means the presence of those markers was known too. The board. The word known hung in the air longer than anything else he had said that night. Not misunderstood. Not overlooked. Known. Deborah's fingers tightened against the edge of the table, the knuckles paling slightly under the overhead lights. "I did not personally review every attachment," she said, her voice lower now, more controlled but lacking the certainty it carried that morning. It was the first time she stepped away from the idea that she was fully aware. The first time she admitted distance. The property manager did not challenge her directly. He did not need to. "Responsibility does not require personal review of every line," he said. "It requires adherence to what has been submitted and acknowledged." That was the moment everything locked into place. Not with noise. Not with confrontation. Just alignment. Every piece that had been introduced throughout the day now sat together on that table. The camera footage. The before and after images. The residue on the glass. The fragment I had preserved. The email thread. The court language. And now, the acknowledgment. It was no longer about what Deborah believed or intended. It was about what had already been established and what she chose to act against anyway. One of the board members leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his eyes no longer on me but fixed on the documents, like he was recalculating everything he thought this situation was. Another member folded his hands together, avoiding eye contact entirely, staring down at the polished surface of the table where the reflections of the overhead lights shimmered faintly. Deborah remained still for a moment longer, then finally looked in my direction. Not with the same sharpness as before. Not with control. Just a brief, searching glance, like she was trying to understand how something she dismissed so easily had turned into something this immovable. I held her gaze for a second, then let it go, because this was never about winning that kind of moment. The structure on that table had already done the work. The property manager gathered the documents into a neat stack again, tapping them lightly against the surface to align the edges. "Given the documentation and confirmed sequence of events," he said, "this matter will proceed under formal review with full compliance oversight. Interim actions will be implemented immediately." He did not list them all out in that moment. But he did not need to. The tone alone made it clear that the outcome was no longer flexible. Deborah shifted again, her shoulders drawing in just slightly, the posture of someone who had finally reached the edge of what they could control. She opened her mouth once more, as if to offer something else, some final explanation or adjustment, but nothing came out this time. The space for that had already passed. I reached forward and closed my folder, the soft sound of its sealing echoing just enough in the quiet room to mark the end of my part in this. I had not argued. I had not raised my voice. I had not needed to prove anything beyond placing the facts where they belonged. And now those facts were doing exactly what they were meant to do. As the meeting began to shift toward next steps and procedural language, the kind that sounds dry but carries real consequence, I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked at the table one last time. Everything that started that morning with a single motion of a scraper had led here. Not because I pushed it, not because I fought it, but because I let it unfold exactly as it was supposed to. Deborah thought she removed something insignificant, but what she actually did was reveal everything that had been in place long before she ever touched that glass. And now, for the first time since the day began, she was no longer the one deciding what happened next. The next morning did not arrive with noise or confrontation. It arrived with quiet precision, the kind that follows decisions already made somewhere beyond your reach. The sun had not fully burned through the early haze yet when I stepped outside, coffee still warm in my hand, and saw the first sign that everything from the night before had carried through exactly the way it was supposed to. A marked service vehicle was parked 2 spaces down from mine, hazard lights blinking in a steady rhythm, the orange glow reflecting off the same stretch of pavement where Deborah had stood less than 24 hours earlier. 2 technicians stood beside it, one holding a clipboard, the other carefully aligning a fresh sheet of material against my windshield, measuring distance down to the inch. Not guessing, not adjusting by eye, following exact placement. I stopped a few feet away and watched for a second, the air still cool enough to carry the faint scent of adhesive before it set. The new sticker matched the original perfectly, same dimensions, same positioning, placed exactly where the outline had been left behind. That outline, the ghost shape Deborah created when she removed it, had become their guide. One of the technicians glanced over at me briefly, then back at his work, focused, deliberate, like this was not a favor, but a correction. That was the difference. This was not someone fixing something casually. This was something being restored properly. Across the lot, the clubhouse doors opened, and Deborah stepped out slowly, not in her usual quick, decisive stride, but with a hesitation that had not been there before. She stopped just outside the entrance, taking in the scene, her eyes moving from the service vehicle to my truck, then settling on the technician pressing the final edge of the sticker into place. For a moment, she did not move at all. The morning light caught her face in a way that made every small reaction visible, the tightening around her eyes, the slight shift in her jaw, the realization settling in piece by piece. This was no longer something she could reinterpret or explain away. It was physical, visible, documented again, this time not by her, but by the same system she had triggered. The technician smoothed the surface one last time, then stepped back, checking alignment against his clipboard before nodding once to his partner. Done. Exact. Final. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the heat settle in my chest as I looked at the glass. Clean. Precise. Back to where it was supposed to be. Not because I argued for it. Not because I demanded it. But because it was required. Deborah took a few steps forward, stopping several yards away, close enough to see clearly, far enough to avoid stepping into the moment. Her arms folded instinctively, but not with the same authority as before. This time it looked more like she was holding herself in place. The property manager appeared behind her, speaking quietly, not loud enough for me to hear, but enough to shift her posture again. She nodded once, slower this time, then turned slightly away, her attention no longer on controlling the situation, but on understanding what it had become. I walked closer to my truck, running my eyes over the sticker, the edges sealed perfectly, the surface catching the early light without a single ripple. For a brief second, I reached out and touched the glass beside it, feeling the coolness of it, the solid presence of something that had been removed and now restored with more weight than before. The fragment I had saved still sat inside on the dashboard, a small reminder of the moment everything changed. I did not need to hold it again. It had already done its job. Around us, the neighborhood moved like any other morning. Car doors opened. Engine started. Someone walked a dog along the sidewalk, leash slack, unaware of what had unfolded here. That is how it always is. The biggest shifts rarely look like anything from the outside. They happen quietly, in documents, in records, in decisions that ripple outward without needing attention. Deborah turned once more before heading back toward the clubhouse, her gaze passing over my truck one last time. But this time there was no correction in it, no judgment, no sense of ownership, just acknowledgment, the kind that comes too late to change anything. I stood there for a moment longer, the sun rising higher now, warming the surface of the glass, catching the edge of the sticker in a clean, steady line. The same spot, the same placement, but everything about it meant something different now. She thought she removed something ugly, something unnecessary, something she had the authority to fix. What she actually did was activate a system designed to respond to exactly that kind of decision. And when it did not argue. It did not raise its voice. It simply corrected everything, step by step, until the only thing left was the truth, placed right back where it belonged.